All right. I don't know if we missed it, but let's take a look. I guess it depends on the exchange. Um, the index, it hit 99, 969, 970. So it looks like it's about to hit 100K. I have to imagine that it hit 100K somewhere already, but I'm a little afraid to go to another exchange and look because I don't want to miss it here. It hasn't hit 100K on the index that I use. So we'll at least follow that. I know I'm sure it hit 100K somewhere. Um, but let's see if we can ring it in here on the index, as it hasn't actually hit 100K here just yet. Just about $70 to go. It looks like the high so far on this is 99,982. So it's almost there. 99,977, 990. Let me clip this at 100. There it is. 100K. We caught it. All right, tweeted it out. All right, we caught it. I know. I'm sure it hit 100K already on a different, on an exchange, but at least what I use, and you have to have some, standard, right? At least what I use, it just hit 100K. So $100,077. Now, I do imagine if we were to go over to Coinbase, oh, looks like it just hit it on Coinbase too, within the last couple of minutes or so. So yeah, I mean it all just hit in the last couple of minutes or so. Let's see at Binance. Yeah, Binance, it just hit it when we saw it. So it hit it at Binance when we saw it. It looks like it hit it on Coinbase maybe a couple minutes sooner. Let's check Kraken. Kraken, it hasn't even hit 100K yet. It's really interesting because some of the exchanges it's hit 100K, and then other exchanges it hasn't hit 100K. So it will be kind of interesting because one of the things to keep in mind, and I'm not asking you to take it to the bank, but one thing to keep in mind here is, and we've talked about this before, there does exist a scenario where Bitcoin dominance bounces, and the reason why it could happen is if Bitcoin is doing exactly what it's doing right now, where it's breaking out into uncharted territory, right? You have this threshold that's hard for Bitcoin to break above. And so while it's holding there below 100K, everything else has the flexibility and the freedom to make their own moves, right? And you've seen a lot of altcoins make their own moves. And that's why I have said many times, at 60% Bitcoin dominance, it's worthwhile to be diversified. And for those that took that advice, non-financial advice, hopefully you saw some pretty impressive gains in the altcoin market. There's a couple of things to remember though. When Bitcoin breaks out, right? If it does sustain a breakout above 100, then you could see money flow from the altcoin market back to Bitcoin. And the reason for that is because when Bitcoin moves, the rest of the market will often sit still and not really do anything. We've seen that before. It's not that they won't do anything. I mean, that they can go up. I'm not suggesting that they can't go up at all. It's just that they start underperforming Bitcoin again. So essentially the same thing happened in 2020. And look, the top for dominance very well could be in, right? I mean, it very well could be in. And my point is, whether it's in or not, it doesn't really matter, right? It was worth diversifying at 60% dominance. But essentially what happened in 2020 was that alts started to run in November into early December, and then Bitcoin broke out again in December, and then Bitcoin dominance went up once again. So, you always have to keep that in mind. And with Bitcoin above 100K, it sort of raises the question, well, if the sell wall is down, then how high could it run, right? How high could it run? And if Bitcoin starts to move, then a lot of that money from the altcoin market could go back into Bitcoin. One of the things I mentioned previously was it could very well be some of the liquidity coming from the altcoin market that helps push Bitcoin to these higher milestones, right? That as the liquidity flows back, because it's sort of like a pendulum where it'll go over to Bitcoin and then it'll go back to the altcoin market. But then when it's time for Bitcoin to move again, what happens, right? This is what happens. Bitcoin dominance starts shooting back up. And I don't know how high it's going to go, but you can see what I'm talking about, right? The Bitcoin dominance then just starts moving back up. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing the flows basically back to Bitcoin from the altcoin market to some degree. Right now, that's not entirely true. I mean, it's not like altcoins are necessarily going down right now, although a lot of them are, right? I mean, a lot of them are actually red on the day. I don't know why Rivian's right here in the crypto one, but a lot of the alts are actually red on the day, and Bitcoin is green. And so we've talked about that idea, and basically it goes something like this. I've said it many times, right? When the dog's away, the cat will play, right? So if Bitcoin's not moving, then Ethereum has the freedom to move. But if Ethereum's not moving, if the cat doesn't move, then the mice will play. The mice are the altcoins. So when the dog's away, then the cat can play. The cat doesn't come out and play, then the mice will play. And then when the mice plays, that's when you get your Altseason, when Bitcoin dominance aggressively goes down. But the problem for alts, it's not really a problem that's going to keep you up at night. It's just a problem in so much as, if you're trying to make sure you're not missing out on the Bitcoin move, what can happen is that Bitcoin steals the show, and some of those gains in the altcoin market can just go right back to Bitcoin. So you have to remember that, and that's something I've mentioned a few times. But again, like, it's not an investing strategy at this point. I mean, for 3.5 years, the Bitcoin dominant strategy was just the investing strategy, right? Just stay Bitcoin heavy until 60% dominance, and then diversify. And I don't think anyone who's stuck to that strategy is upset at all right now. Stuck with Bitcoin till 60%. You diversified some. Hopefully, you got a 2x or a 3x or something in the altcoin market. And just remember that there's a chance that Bitcoin moves again. And one of the things to remember, and we've looked at this quite a lot, is if you go look at year-to-date ROI. So we're going to look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin. You look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in halving years, normally it is around this time when it starts to move up, right? On average, right? If you take the average of 2012, 2016, and 2020, and you average that out, what you'll notice is that 2024 Bitcoin is following the average of prior halving years almost perfectly right now, right? You see that? And so if this were to continue, I can't possibly know how high it's going to go. But if it were to continue through the end of the year, it would basically put it at a 3x from the yearly open. Again, I don't know if it's going to go that high. If you compare it to 2016, you can see that it's basically already achieved the year-to-date ROI by the end of the halving year in 2016, right? It's already achieved it. But you look at 2012 and 2020, and you can see that Bitcoin actually went higher. So my argument here is that if Bitcoin continues this move, and it doesn't just, let's say it goes on for a week or two, right? Let's say it actually goes on. if you look back at 2020, when Bitcoin started moving, it can give you some clues. And we actually talked a little bit about this in the dubious speculation video that we did on Bitcoin, where the argument was, what if we're right here? Look at this. It's actually playing out almost identically right now. You see this? You see this, right? So green candle, right? A big November, okay, starting in late October, get a big November. And then the week of November 23rd, so the week of November 16th, big green candle. The week of November 23rd, you go nowhere. You just get a wicks in either direction with a small candle body, with the candle body being red. And then the next week, you got another green candle that took out the highs. You see that? That was the week of November 30th, right? The week of November 30th. Well, if you look at what week we're currently in, it's basically the same thing, right? 2 weeks ago, the week of November 18th, big green candle. The following week, November 25th, just a red candle with wicks in either direction, but the candle body was small. And then now you could argue that we are simply getting this candle, right? Where it breaks above 100K. Now, what's really interesting is to see what did Bitcoin dominance do in that situation, right? What did it actually do when Bitcoin made that move? And so what happened was initially during that first red week, Bitcoin dominance fell off a cliff. You see that? Like it fell off a cliff. It basically dropped from 65% all the way down to 62%, right? So 3% in just a couple of weeks. And then somehow the dominance then rallied from 63 all the way up to 70. Now, for me, 60% dominance is good enough to diversify, right? I think it's getting greedy to not have some level of diversification after 60% dominance, because there's a good chance alts will make those moves, and we've talked a little bit about those, and some of them have made really good moves. But from an academic perspective, right, an academic pursuit, not this is how you should invest pursuit, but just an academic perspective, is it possible for dominance to go higher again, right? And you can see that in 2020, it did get one final surge. And then there was a correction by Bitcoin that occurred in January of the halving year, right? January of the halving year. Or sorry, no, January of the post-halving year. You finally got a correction. But again, I mean, the correction occurred. It was still a higher low, but you still got a 30% correction or something like that. So the point, though, is if Bitcoin rallies into the end of the year, right? And if it rallies into, say, a year after the spot ETF launch, we talked about that. It could rally, 52 weeks, 54 weeks. 54 weeks would put it the week of inauguration, January 20th, the same time that Gary Gensler resigns. That could get you, that next leg up. And then maybe you get a correction after that. Now, if it does play out like 2020, you should know that there's a chance where we just kind of go above 100K here, and then next week we fall back below it again, right? And I don't know if that's what's going to happen or not. I guess if it happens next week, maybe it would be on the back of some inflation print or something. I don't know. But what's interesting about this move from this point in 2020 is that dominance just kept going up, even though it got that second correction. And I think the reason why dominance didn't drop again back then was because it became more clear that Bitcoin was in fact going to break out, right? It pushed the boundary again. It basically broke above the prior all-time high, right? And that's when you see that wick right there. It's when it broke above the prior all-time high. And once it broke above the prior all-time high, then I think people just started piling into Bitcoin again. And then the altcoin market bled to Bitcoin again, right? Again. And I vividly remember it because I just remember thinking, like, there's no way in hell dominance is going to go up again. We'd already seen it go all the way up to 73%. I was like, there's just no way. You know, there's no way it's going to go back up. And it even actually swept the high. I know it doesn't look like it on here, but if you look at sort of the intraday wicks, dominance put in a higher level. And that was the important thing to remember, is that it did go up again. And so obviously, you know, right now dominance looks a lot different. It still is fairly down from this move of the last couple of weeks. But look, guys, Bitcoin's above 100K. Here might be a telltale sign. All right. Let's suppose for a minute that, you know, next week we get a pullback, right? Not a deep pullback, but, you know, maybe just a slight pullback. If you see dominance go up on a pullback, okay? Because what have you been seeing recently for the last like 2 weeks, or the last 3 weeks, ever since dominance hit 60%? What have you seen happen? Every time Bitcoin pulls back and kind of pauses, the mice come out, right? The altcoins come out and they start scurrying around. They start chasing the cheese. Everyone wants to get rich on altcoins. So the mice come out to play, because the cat, I don't know what ETH is doing, right? It's still sitting below 0.04. Cat's doing its own damn thing, right? No one knows what ETH is doing. My guess is ETH doesn't start to move until later this year, early next year, when it always does. The end of December, or it doesn't even have to be the end of December. I'm talking about ETH Bitcoin, not ETH USD. Get off my back. ETH Bitcoin. A lot of times it doesn't start to move until sometime in December, or latest January, right? It could take until January. There is some precedent for that. So again, if the dog's away, the cat will play. If the cat's away, the mice will play. And when Ethereum's not moving, when Bitcoin's not moving, the altcoin market will move. Now, if the dog comes back out, Bitcoin starts moving again, the mice are going to scurry off. And the reason is because when Bitcoin moves, the altcoin market bows to the king. They bow to the king. That's just the way the market works. I don't control it. You don't control it. No one controls it. That's just what happens, right? When Bitcoin moves, everything else just kind of watches. Now, look, you're going to find a day here and there where the altcoin market can go up, even if Bitcoin's running. But if Bitcoin continues to run, let's say it continues to run, and let's move beyond, you know, let's look at this really closely. Let's dissect this, okay? And we'll also look at 2016 as well. But, you know, if it does this number, where if we're right here and it's sort of breaking above that major barrier, that barrier that's like this mental block for a lot of people, like, will it go above 100? Will it not? With it breaking above it, if it breaks back down next week, just a small correction, and dominance goes up next week, then no one has a crystal ball, including and especially myself. But if dominance goes up next week, then there is a very high chance that dominance will then just go up for the next 3 to 4 weeks after that, right? And going up into the end of the year. There's no guarantee, right? There can be fake outs, but, you know, we've actually made the comparison here as well between this and the QQQ. And if you go look at the QQQ in 1999 when it launched, it had a little trouble breaking through 100 as well. And once it finally got through 100 here, first week of February, second week of February, the following week, it dropped back down to 95 again, right? But then the following week after that, for the next 4 or 5 weeks, it was just up, 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 up for 5 weeks straight, basically. 4 weeks straight. 5 weeks straight. I was right the first time, right? 5 weeks straight. I mean, it's technically a green candle. I guess it's not up that week, but so it's really interesting, right? It's really interesting that if it were to play out like that, where it's, you know, it's sort of breaking through 100K this week, and it's sort of, you know, it's kind of feeling what's out there, seeing what's what. You know, I mean, you know, you're basically exploring uncharted territory right now for Bitcoin above 100K. So it's really interesting as to what the market's going to do. And all I'm saying, we're a product of our experience, right? If you experience something, then you're probably more likely to think it could happen in the future. Prior cycles, I was a, you know, a casualty to the Bitcoin dominance uptrend. So this cycle, I made sure not to be a casualty to the Bitcoin dominance uptrend. I stayed Bitcoin heavy until 6% dominance, took some risk, saw some alts run. I'm happy. dominance top could be in. It very well could be. And I'm not suggesting that just because you get a dominance rally, it does not have to take out the prior high. It doesn't. It could be a lower high. But there is still a chance that dominance goes back up with Bitcoin breaking out, because it did the same thing in 2020. I mean, it was the same damn thing, right? The same thing. If we're here, it's even the same week too, right? I mean, this is the week of November 30th. This is the week of December 2nd, right? It's basically the same week of the year. So I guess the way to interpret it is like, if it has trouble breaking out to say like 110 or something, if it keeps hesitating, it could just simply be waiting for all the macro data to come in, right? Bring in the labor market data, bring in the inflation data. Once you got all that behind you, then it might really pave the move for another move up. So if this happens, if that happens in say a week or two, dominance is going to go up, right? More than likely. I mean, I can't say for sure, but that's more than likely what would happen. In fact, and again, that's not an investing strategy, right? It's okay to have diversified portfolios in altcoins. I've said that many times, and you're not going to fall. I mean, look, guys, I have exposure to altcoins. I have exposure to this other stuff too, but it doesn't mean that we can't try to figure out what dominance is going to do. But look what happened last year. Look what happened last year when Bitcoin broke out. It's almost a carbon copy, actually. If you look at Bitcoin dominance when Bitcoin broke out last year, when it broke out, Bitcoin dominance topped. You see that? Almost immediately. When Bitcoin USD broke out, Bitcoin dominance topped for a while. Same thing happened this year, right? When Bitcoin broke out, Bitcoin dominance topped. And Bitcoin USD continued to slowly go higher. And then Bitcoin dominance just kind of like moved around in here, right? It didn't, I mean, it got some pullbacks, but then once Bitcoin got another big move up like that, then Bitcoin dominance really started to go up again, right? So it's just something to keep in mind. And it's not so much about will dominance put in a new all-time high or a new cycle high. It's just trying to figure out what, directionally, where is it going to go? I said before that alts could easily rally on their Bitcoin pairs in November. And there is a chance that they just continue that rally into December as well. But I do remember, some of these moves that happened in November of 2020, early December 2020. And, everyone thought that alts were just going to keep on rallying on their Bitcoin pairs. And then Bitcoin was like, hold on a second, hey, don't forget about me. Without Bitcoin, the rest of the market doesn't exist, right? I mean, Bitcoin was essentially saying that. And so then what happened is dominance got another rally. And it went from, 62% all the way up to 73% on at least daily timeframes. If you go to the daily, it went up more. And you can see it right here, right? It went all the way up to like 73%. It even wicked above the prior high if you look at the hourly wicks. So it's really a fascinating way to look at the market. Now, it does not make sense to have tunnel vision, right? Obviously, it does not make sense to have tunnel vision. If you get one idea in your head and you can't see anything beyond that, then, you could end up regretting it, right? So don't go into it assuming you know what's going to happen, because I can promise you no one here does, including and especially me. So with that in mind, right, there's always a chance that it doesn't break higher beyond, marginally where it is right now. And we end up having to wait a little bit longer, right? That's always a possibility. There are some, I mean, even in March, right, you saw there was a couple of week pullback, and then it got a green week up, and then it pulled back again. This doesn't really feel like that, right? It doesn't really feel like that to me right now, but there's always a possibility that something like that happens. Right, where you get sort of a big move up, and then you get a red candle, and then it just sort of slightly goes higher, draws everyone in, and then the market just nukes, right? Always a chance that happens, right? Always a chance. But look, listen, guys, I mean, there's always a chance of anything, right? I mean, the world could end tomorrow. Um, it's all about what risk do you want to take on, right? As I've said before, there's no free lunch. Um, you don't, what risk, right? What risk are you going to take? And, for the longest time, it was just so easy to just bet on Bitcoin, right? And just say, you know what, to hell with everything else. I'm just going to bet on the Bitcoin dominance rally until 60% dominance. But at 60%, time to diversify. Because here's the thing. I mean, even if dominance does go higher at this point, even if it doesn't mean that all altcoins go lower on their Bitcoin pairs, right? In fact, there's probably a lot of alts that have already bottomed on their Bitcoin pairs. So you have to remember that too, right? Even if dominance goes higher, it doesn't mean that every alt has to go lower on their Bitcoin pairs. Obviously, if dominance goes higher, a lot of alts would go lower on their Bitcoin pairs. But, some of the alts that have rallied the hardest off their lows would have a much harder time going to new lows against Bitcoin. The alts that have not rallied off their lows that much, might just go to new lows against Bitcoin, right? Because they're bleeders, right? And you want to try to stay away from the bleeders and stick with the ones that are oscillators at best. So that's I think that really is sort of the how to understand this market, and to, at any given point as an investor, when you want exposure to something, right? Because if you just sit in cash all the time, you're just going to bleed to inflation. If you want exposure to something, you always want to figure out, like, where do you put that money? Do you put it in Bitcoin? You put it in altcoins? When dominance was making that climb to 60, it just made sense to stay with Bitcoin. Once 60, diversifying's okay in my mind. Clearly, diversifying was okay before 60% dominance. But for my strategy, right, the one that I've communicated, that's what made the most amount of sense to me. Doesn't necessarily mean it made the most amount of sense to everyone else, but to me, it made sense just to stick with Bitcoin until 60% dominance, diversify at 60%, but also respect the king, and just know that if it does break out again, which is what it's doing right now, right, it could take some of that liquidity back. And you're seeing that happen to a small degree here. But the reality is Bitcoin dominance is still down a lot right now. I mean, even with this, look at this wick right here. Even with this wick, it's still down a lot. I mean, it was at 61% just a couple of weeks ago. But you know what that tells me? As an investor, right? You got to think about sort of the shifts in liquidity, right? What it tells me is that there's still theoretically plenty of liquidity to just go back to Bitcoin, right? I mean, if Bitcoin's at a higher price today than it was over here, but dominance is way down here now, right? Dominance is way down here. So that, I think, is, something to consider. But I guess the other point to make is that, and the reason why it's not necessarily going to lead to a new high by dominance, right? The reason why it could lead to a dominance rally, but it doesn't mean it leads to a new high. It could lead to a new high, but the reason why it doesn't necessarily lead to a new high is because, even in 2021, right, when dominance had its cycle high, it dropped even while Bitcoin went up. And there were some pretty long wicks over here, right? There was, some pretty long wicks where it seemed like Bitcoin dominance might go back up, but it didn't really, right? I mean, it got a few rallies, but it didn't really go back up. And then a couple months later, you got a major drop by Bitcoin dominance, right? So I think that's the reason it makes sense to, to have some level of diversification, because there's no guarantee that dominance goes higher. And if it does go higher and it's on a Bitcoin rally, then your alt's probably doing okay on its USD pair, even as bleeding against Bitcoin. If it's on a Bitcoin dump, obviously that would be somewhat unfortunate. But that's why we pay a lot of attention to the labor market. We try to see how it's holding up. If it's holding up okay, if it's not, Initial claims still remain relatively low. I don't really think it's problematic until they're printing 300K, which they're still not. I think the last print was like 213K. So the labor market is still theoretically holding up okay. We'll see where the unemployment rate comes in, but that's still a couple days away. So maybe Bitcoin is sniffing out the labor market print. Maybe it knows what's up. I've had this theory for a long time that Bitcoin kind of knows what's up. It knows what's happening before you see it happen. And it could be the reason why, Bitcoin went down for 6 months. It was because the unemployment rate was going up for basically that amount of time, right? In a somewhat aggressive manner, right? It was really trending up right here. And that was why Bitcoin was going down. So sometimes I wonder if Bitcoin is sort of sniffing it out right before it happens. Like it knows what's going to happen. It's trying to tell us, and then we'll get confirmation in a couple of days. But yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing in the market. And if you go look at cycle ROI, right? ROI after the bottom for Bitcoin, and we've talked about this a lot. Like it always feels like this time is different, but Bitcoin's ROI is still just between last cycle and 2 cycles ago. Right? It's basically where it always is at this point in the cycle. Right? It's where it always is. So it doesn't feel like it's different when you look at it like that, even though I'm not gonna lie, right? You look around, you're just seeing all these meme coins, go crazy, and you're like, well, how much longer we truly have? I try to stay focused, right? And I try to say, like, I can't be bothered, right? I have to stick with the data and what does that say? And that's why I look at these charts, to try to keep myself grounded. And I'm always looking for reasons like what am I missing, right? What could I be missing? And the only thing is, if the labor market comes in bad, right? If the labor market comes in bad, then yeah, I mean, I guess it could undo all this, but we'll know in a couple days. And it feels like Bitcoin's trying to tell us that it's gonna, that the labor market's not gonna be that bad, but we'll see. I mean, obviously, we won't know until a couple days from now. We'll see what Bitcoin has in store between now and then. But as you can see, I mean, the minute the minute that Bitcoin starts going up, Bitcoin dominance just reclaims it, right? I mean, the dominance candle, by the way, is almost green for the week. It just turned green. So I'm not suggesting you should go trade all your alts for Bitcoin. I'm just saying sometimes you got to respect the king, right? And when the king moves, the mice scurry away and they wait for the king to stop moving. And when the king stops moving, if ETH moves, then the altcoin market will still not move. But if ETH doesn't move after Bitcoin stops, then the altcoin market will move again. Okay. So that's kind of how this part of the cycle works. So, I mean, right now, Bitcoin's just going up. I mean, now it's at 103. We almost hit 104. And this is sort of that exciting time. And I mean, you can see dominance is almost back up to 57. I mean, it was at 54 earlier today, wasn't it? I mean, I guess yesterday. Oh yeah. I mean, because we just got a new daily candle that just started like 3 hours ago. But yeah, I mean, like literally earlier today, dominance was at 54.7% or so. Dominance is up 2% in a day. And this is essentially what happened in 2020, right? You had you got a big drop by dominance. You see it right here, right? This is what I'm talking about. Here. You see that move by dominance? This is what I remember in 2020. Again, I'm not saying you gotta use that as an investing strategy. I'm sure the altcoin market, if Bitcoin goes higher, the altcoin market will be just fine. I mean, they might bleed on their Bitcoin pairs, but as we've learned, none of you guys truly care about that. But look at this, right? You know, Bitcoin dominance basically fell off a cliff in November of 2020. In fact, it dropped about 10%, right? A 10% drop. And then it bottomed out, and then it kind of just slowly started to go back up, and then it accelerated in December, and then it topped January 3rd. January 3rd, right? But it topped how many days after the bottom in November, right? How many days? 40 days after the sort of that short-term Bitcoin dominance bottom. You see that? I really hope it's not this simple as to connecting the dots and looking at the same thing. Like, look, let's just see. You connect the dots, that's where that wick came in. I don't know if it's going to be that simple. It's not too far off. It's not that far off from doing something kind of similar. Especially if you look at it like that, you know, if you ignore sort of the long wicks down. But I'll tell you this, and I'll tell you this. The key thing to watch for, I think, would be when there's a pullback. I don't know when it's going to be. Consult your, the person you follow that gets everything right. Consult them. When there's a pullback, and I'm not even talking about a big pullback, right? But whenever there's a pullback, if dominance goes up on the pullback, then dominance should go up a lot if Bitcoin then rallies again. If Bitcoin goes down on a pullback, then the implication would be that there is still that risk, that appetite for the altcoin market, right? But let's say 40 days from this potential low. And again, you could have a dominance rally that does not lead to a new high by dominance, but it might go up for 40 days. That puts you January 12th. Again, the only reason I'm bringing this stuff up is because January 12th is about, it's just about a year after the ETF launch. Which is fascinating to think about how, it could be playing out in a similar fashion, as some of these prior ETF launches that we've looked at. But yeah, I think it's been a really interesting cycle, to say the least. And you can see Bitcoin is basically where it always is, as measured from the peak. It's actually still doing a pretty good job of following last cycle, right? If you look at last cycle, it is actually following that one the closest right now. You see that? Here, it's sort of connected with it here. About 2 months ago, and for the last couple of months, it's kind of been following what last cycle was doing around this time. If you look at it compared to 2 cycles ago, it's actually a little bit ahead. And you can actually see, if you compare it to 2 cycles ago, 2016 cycle, it went up a little bit more. Like, for, let's say we're on day 1123, right? It went up for like 4 more days and then got a pullback. And then it still continued to go up, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like, you're going to get some of these pullbacks at some point, and it'll be interesting to see what dominance does during that time. Again, for me, 60% was good enough. I think, to hope for too much beyond that is somewhat greedy. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means that, there's a difference between being right and making money, right? I mean, you can be right, but not make money. You can be wrong and make money. I don't know about you guys, but I'd rather be rich and wrong than poor and right. And I've said that many, many times. Like, put the ego by the door. And in this case, it's one of those things where, people keep asking me, like, well, what if dominance hasn't topped, right? What if it hasn't topped? I'm like, okay, what if? What if it goes higher? What then? I mean, so what? You still did okay with some of the alts, hopefully. If you've been identifying double bottoms, or if you've been collecting some of those, I mean, it's not like you're hurting, even if dominance goes higher at this point. My main point was, why not preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio during the most obvious Bitcoin dominance uptrend that we've had, and it seemed like a fairly obvious Bitcoin dominance uptrend. So let's check in with some other indicators. So total crypto market cap and trend line, we're about 16% above the fair value right now. So just slightly above it. If we go look at the Pi cycle top, moving average division, it's still pretty low right now. I mean, it's only like 0.561. Actually, you know what we should look at? We should look at the extension from the 20-week moving average. That might be really interesting to look at. At some point, it's got to break. I don't know if it's going to break now or not, but I mean, at some point, it seemingly would have to. But here we go. So if you look at the extension from the 20-week moving average, I don't know if it's updated here. I mean, it looks like it's, yeah, okay, it's moving up a little bit here, right? You see that? But this is one of those things where, like, you know, depending on how you connect the tops, right? How do you connect them? You know, which points do you draw it through? Just sort of drawing it like that, you know, you can see that it, you know, anytime it gets too heated, the market can cool off for a little bit, right? Like if it, especially if you just sort of connect it through these peaks here in January of 2021, February 2021, it's getting a little close. Why don't we do our little exercise? So we're going to go to Wolfram Alpha, and we'll do our little exercise here. This actually worked out pretty well, by the way. A few weeks ago, we did the same exercise, and I said that probably meant that Bitcoin would find a local top that week of like 93K, and that was exactly the local top for that week. So let's go through the exercise again and just kind of see what's what, you know, with it. First of all, I guess it's going to depend on, you know, what wicks you connect this to. So let's first be a little liberal in the connection of the dots, and let's ignore these because that would make us draw it lower. Let's connect it like that. Let's get it through these two 2021 peaks. If you connect it like that and you get a price label and you put it here, it's 0.42. Okay, now the 20-week moving average is what right now? 70.4K, 74.45. So 74.45. So we're going to go over here. We're going to say the natural log of the price. So 70, no, we're solving for the price. Divided by the 20-week moving average, 74.45 equals, what was it, 0.42? I believe it was 0.42. Yeah. So if we are very liberal with our placement of this trend line, about as liberal as you can be, right? Because you're basically ignoring, you know, a lot of these prior aggressive moves, right? But if we connect it through the 2021 tops, which seems like a reasonable place to connect it, where would that say Bitcoin, you know, where could it go this week? Again, this doesn't mean that it can't go higher next week. Doesn't even mean it can't go higher this week. But where would it imply what's possible in the short term? Well, if you solve for X, it's 107K, right? So 107,000 would be if it goes all the way up to 0.42 on this trend line. Now, if you're a little bit more conservative and you kind of draw it through the 2017 peak and the 2013 peak, then you can see it actually kind of already goes below these, you know, these levels, kind of like it did in 2021. So you could kind of go through the middle of it and maybe even connect it through the 2021 or the 2024 top, and you can kind of see we're already there. But again, this trend line has to break eventually, right? It has to. And the reason, I'm not just saying that, the reason it has to break is because if it doesn't break, then eventually, you know, the lower high trend line will go below zero. And the reason it can't do that forever is because it would imply the price of Bitcoin's always below its 20-week moving average eventually. And if you actually just extend this trend line out, you can see that it would basically hit zero in November of 2028. Now, clearly, I'm not expecting for Bitcoin to always stay below its 20-week moving average for the rest of its life. So therefore, at some point, the trend line has to break. So this is one of those things where it's not really anything you can take to the bank. I've tried before and they didn't cash it in, but it's just some fun, dubious speculation to just get an idea on what's sort of theoretically possible in the short term, right? And I mean, you can see some of these alts are moving a little bit, right? It's not that they can't move. It's just that a lot of times when Bitcoin moves, 4 to 5% in a day, Bitcoin dominance will then get a nice move back up. So I guess the real question now is, with dominance, are we here or are we here? Right? Where do you think we are? That's kind of the question, right? Are we here in December of 2020, where dominance then shot back up for one more month? Or are we here where dominance already topped out? What's really interesting, if you look closely at what happened in November of 2020, it kind of looks similar to today, where you had a wick up, and then you had another green candle, and then you had a red candle with a wick higher than the last two candles. You see that? A wick up, and these two candles there. Big drop. But here you can see the kind of the same thing, right? You had a wick up and then a big drop. The reason it's not as obvious to me that the reason why it doesn't necessarily have to be this is, this held support at the 20-week moving average, but this one didn't, right? I mean, it didn't hold support at the 20-week moving average. Furthermore, we already retraced to the 618, and this, we already retraced to the 618 fib. And over here, that's where it went, right? The 618. Maybe it goes in for a double top. I don't know. Why don't we check in with dominance excluding stables? Because I feel like that one really broke down. You know, I mean, you look at that, it looks like, we talked about it just topping here or maybe getting one more push higher. Not that it matters. I said that back then. It does not matter. It makes sense to diversify either way. I mean, it kind of looks like it broke down. Let me switch to a regular scale. It kind of looks like it already broke down, right? Doesn't it? I mean, like, I'm just being objective. And I mean, this is coming from someone who used to be very, very bullish on Bitcoin dominance, right? I mean, I was almost a toxic Bitcoin maxi for 3 years. And some of you guys would probably call me that. And I mean, like, I can envision a scenario where dominance goes and puts in a new high, but it would have to repair a lot of damage to do that. I mean, look at this wedge. This is the Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins. We talked about it for years, going back up to the top of this wedge at 65%, and it finally did, and then it broke down. So, I mean, if the top's not in on it, then you'd have to have a very drastic move. What's really interesting is if you look at Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance plus USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, this drop was a really big drop, right? The same drop in November of 2020 wasn't this big, right? So that's another reason it's not as clear that dominance has to go put in a new high. Like, it doesn't, because when it got this drop, it just held support at the 20 at the bull market support band. You see that? But this time it didn't do that, right? It dropped all the way down to 72%, which is a really big drop. So then you could say, well, what if we're just here, right? Where it just levels out for a couple of weeks and then it continues to go down. Either way, as fun as the Bitcoin dominance journey was, and I said this, that, whenever the dominance journey ends, I think everyone's going to kind of miss it, because it's the easiest part of the cycle, right? You stay Bitcoin heavy for 3 years. you pretend like the other part of the market doesn't exist, and you just watch you watch basically most alts, but not your alts, bleed against Bitcoin, right? Everyone else's alts just keep bleeding against Bitcoin. Your alts are doing fine because you picked out the ones that don't bleed against Bitcoin. But you just kind of get to sit there and watch everyone else's alts bleed back to the king during the Bitcoin dominance uptrend. So when I look at a chart like this, I'm like, it's harder to make that case, that you get that same type of move. I guess if you take off the bull market support band, I guess if you take it from this wick and you go all the way up, that was a 17% move up. So 17% move up. I guess it could still get up there, but it's a tall order. I mean, it's a very tall order. Something drastic, I think, would have to happen in the cryptoverse for it to move up that much. And this is also, incorporating stablecoin dominance, right? USDT and USDC dominance. So, and those have been dropping recently. So you got USDT dominance dropping, you got USDC dominance dropping. You also have ETH dominance dropping, right? So look at this. If you just look at USDT dominance plus USDC dominance plus ETH dominance, they've got to all be dropping, right? And they've all been dropping since August of 2022. They've just been dropping. So the only reason since August of 2022 that this metric was going up at all was because of Bitcoin dominance, right? This is August 2022 over here. Right here. So the only reason this metric was able to go up through here was because Bitcoin dominance was going up. Because everything else is basically dropping. So I would almost argue that if you ever have a move like this, it would have to be one of two things. It would either have to be a crazy surge by Bitcoin to the upside, where truly everything just bleeds back to the king for like 4 or 5 weeks straight, like it did in 2020. Or if it's on a Bitcoin dump, then that's when you could see, Bitcoin dominance go up with USDT dominance and USDC dominance, right? Then you have three things contributing to the uptrend on this metric, not just one. So there's two different ways it could theoretically play out, but we'll see. Right now, I mean, Bitcoin is at over 100K. We talked a lot about sort of this similar move, right? Where it took about the same amount of time to break out, right? It took about the same amount of time to break out and about 30 weeks. And then here was about 30 weeks. And when Bitcoin broke out in 2019, it only rallied for like a month, and it rallied up to 10,500. 10,500. And then it kind of stalled out, and then it got a landing. Now, again, I'll be the first to tell you, you don't go about investing constantly betting on a landing and when it's going to occur. You have a portfolio that gives you the exposure you want, that sort of represents the risk you're willing to take on. And if there is a landing, then you're properly hedged for it. But you don't constantly bet on it, because the market, as I've said, it does not need a reason to go up. It needs a reason to go down. And unless the labor market's going to give you that reason, then it's probably not going to go down like that, especially. You'd have to have a really bad labor market print to do something like that. And back then it was a really bad. I mean, the unemployment rate went to like 10% overnight practically. So, yeah, I mean, I guess if you had something like that, it's possible for that USDT, Bitcoin dominance, ETH dominance, and USDC dominance to go back up aggressively if Bitcoin dominance goes down on a Bitcoin dump. But it doesn't really seem to be the exact same setup. I think what I would say, it'd be kind of funny though if it's just 10x, it's 10.5, so 105K. I think what makes the most amount of sense right now is to continue to sort of defer to the cyclical view, right? To just kind of say, you know what, the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2024 is doing two things. First of all, it's following the average of 2012, 2016, and 2020, right? Following the average. And you can see that if it does follow the average, it could go a little bit higher and then maybe stall out for a week and then continue the move, right? Which is basically exactly what it did in 2020. It's exactly what it did in 2020, right? It got this green candle up, a new all-time high, the same week that we're in right now, right? The first week of December. The next week got a little bit of a pullback, and then the next week was 22% move up. 22% in 1 week. Okay, 22% in 1 week. That's what happened in 2020. So, year-to-date ROI still matches. Furthermore, if you were to look at it compared to 2023, I've said before, it looks, it kind of just looks like a slightly diminished version of 2023, you know? And this is the crazy thing is like, there's 1,000 different indicators out there to tell you what's going on with Bitcoin, right? 1,000 different indicators. It's just doing what it did in 2023. And it's not only Bitcoin, right? It's not only Bitcoin. Look at Nvidia. It's doing the same thing too. Same thing, right? It's just a slightly diminished version of the prior year. And Bitcoin is doing that very thing right here. It's basically following it almost to the T, just a little bit less. And even in 2023, this is exactly when Bitcoin got to move up, right? And then it consolidated for a little bit, dropped a little, and then moved up again. So that same level. Now, if you look at it for ETH, I think it's following as well, right? It's the same thing as last year. It's just a slightly diminished version of it, right? You see it? Just a slightly diminished version. But it's the same thing, basically. You get a move up early on in the year, it kind of fades, and then you get a low in Q3, and then it rallies on up in Q4. So it's the same thing. We're essentially seeing Ethereum do the same thing that it did last year, just a slightly diminished version of it. Now, what's really interesting is if you go look at asset pairs, you look at ETH Bitcoin, right? Look at ETH Bitcoin 2024 compared to 2023. It's kind of doing the same thing, right? And that's why I've said before, right? I mean, I think there's a good chance that ETH Bitcoin has bottomed. If it hasn't bottomed, it's probably pretty close, right? Like, anything's possible, but I would say absolute worst case scenario is 0.03, right? So watch it flick 0.029 just so people can say I was wrong. That's fine. I'm wrong about everything, right? But 0.03 was always my worst case scenario. And it already went to 0.031, right? I mean, that's good enough for me. I don't feel the need to beg for it to go to 0.03. If it goes there, it goes there. And basically the reason I came up with 0.03 and 60% dominance was just looking at the bubble from last cycle, right? If you look to see when ETH Bitcoin began its bubble, it started at 0.03. So that's like, well, worst case scenario, ETH Bitcoin goes to 0.03, and worst case scenario would be that it happens by the end of 2024 or very early 2025. And when I mean like the first or second week of 2025 at the absolute latest. Absolute latest. So yeah, like there's a chance that ETH Bitcoin could sweep the low and go to 0.03. Chance. If you look closely though, there's a lot of times where ETH Bitcoin bottoms out around now, right? Which is why it's hard to be overly bullish on dominance because it feels like ETH Bitcoin will go up soon. Does it happen in December? Does it happen in January? That's the question. Let's take a look at history. What does history tell us about ETH Bitcoin? 2015. When did ETH Bitcoin bottom? It's a history lesson for all of us, right? When did it bottom? Well, I mean, it technically it bottomed, I guess, in November. So, and maybe it doesn't need to go lower, but you can see that it did come back down in December, and it didn't really start moving up until January. That was the first major candle by ETH Bitcoin, January of 2016. Okay. Now go look at 2017, or sorry, the end of 2016. When did ETH Bitcoin bottom? The last week of December. And then January, the first week of January, big move up after a crazy bleed, but a big move up in January. First week of January. So basically 2016 and 2017, well, I guess this is technically, 2016 and going into 2017, late 2016, it was either the last week of December or the first week of January when ETH Bitcoin started to move. Now you go look at the following year, it bottomed the week of December 4th. Now it's December 4th right now. So that's why you got to be careful, getting too aggressive on Bitcoin dominance, because there's always a chance that ETH Bitcoin goes up sooner, right? It starts, it's possible it starts as early December. If you go later, you go look at 2018, when did ETH Bitcoin start moving up aggressively? December 17th. So that would imply another 2 weeks. 2019, when did it start moving up? Started moving up January 13th, aggressively, right? Everything before then was just kind of meh, 2021, when did ETH Bitcoin start moving up? And by the way, in 2021, you can see that it got a little bit of a pop here in November. And then once you got into the first week of December, it rolled over, put in one final low, bottomed the week of December 21st, right? So there's a chance, right? There's always a chance it could go lower. And if it does go lower, I think it's only going to sweep the low. It's not going to go that much lower than where it already went, right? I really don't think it would go that much lower if it's going to go lower. And I don't even think it has to go lower. Look at last year. What happened? Big move up January 8th. Now, it was short-lived. We said it was going to be short-lived, right? We said it's going to go, ETH Bitcoin's going to go to 0.03 to 0.04. But big move up. And now, we did get a little bit of a move up here in November. Is it, you could have it come back down one last time and then go up, right? It's possible. It is possible. So, as far as ETH Bitcoin, I would say this, right? There's a good chance the low is in. If it's not in, it should be in within the next 4 to 5 weeks, right? 3 weeks ago, I told you guys, worst case scenario would be like 7 to 8 weeks, but it's been 3 weeks, right? So at this point, if the low for ETH Bitcoin is not in, worst case scenario is 4 to 5 more weeks, and then it'll be in. And then no one will care anymore about this whole argument as to whether it's in or not. Because in the grand scheme of things, it's not really going to matter, right? So yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot. And by the way, there's a lot of new followers here in the Cryptoverse. By the way, speaking of new followers, why don't we go check in on the social risk? Let's go check in on the social risk. So, social risk, 0.32. And I don't even know. I keep scratching my head like, where the hell is everyone? It feels like people are coming in. I'm like, well, why the hell is the social risk so damn low? If you go look at YouTube views to various crypto YouTube accounts, it's still not any higher than it was back in March, And this is one of those things where maybe the 100K milestone will finally bring people back. Maybe that's what it needs. Maybe that's what we need for retail to truly come back. But it hasn't happened yet. And this is one of the things that has kept me sort of on the right side of dominance and whatnot for so long. I was like, well, if Altseason's here, where the hell is everyone? And that was what made me stay bullish on dominance until 60%. I'm like, well, the only reason dominance is going to go down is if people come back. People just haven't come back. But maybe this 100K achievement will finally bring people back. Remember, last cycle, dominance still went up a little bit even after social was started to go up. Right here. Dominance topped like right here in that initial surge. So that's the YouTube views. Current Bitcoin risk 0.65. 0.65. Altcoin season index indicator. I think it went to alt season. I mean, you can see it went up here, but it's getting rejected from it, right? It's getting rejected from it. So where did it go in November 2020? That's the real question, right? Where did it go in November 2020? It was all the way down here. I mean, it barely moved, right? So I mean, this does in that sense, it looks a lot different. And it never really started to move back up until until it was actually starting. So it doesn't in that sense looks different. If you look at it on a 30-day time frame, does it look any different? Not really. I mean, you can see there was a slight move here, but the altcoin season index back then on the 30-day time frame only went up to 56, right? Today it went all the way up to 93. I mean, that's how much Bitcoin dominance was dropping. It went all the way up to 93. If you take a 30-day SMA of that, here's the thing, if you take a 30-day SMA of this, you can see that it truly hasn't really been alt season. I guess you could argue technically in the summer of 2022 there were some alts popping against Bitcoin. Mostly it was because Ethereum was going up during the merge, but before that, the last true alt season wasn't, it was basically not since 2021. Like that was the last time this metric even got into the red on a 30-day SMA. So that's the reason why altcoins have bled so much for 3 years, is because anytime they did go up into the alt season range, they only lasted there for a few days before Bitcoin took the keys back. No pun intended, right? Took the keys back to the car and said, I'm driving. And, Bitcoin then said, I'll tell you when alt season is. And then alts just bled again. So it's definitely an interesting time, right? I mean, it's really an interesting time to see what happens and really to see what Bitcoin dominance does. At this point, for me, it's all just academic at this point. I just want to know, are we here or are we here, right? Or are we here? Where you know, what if we're all celebrating 60% dominance being the top, and then a year from now it's just at 70%? I mean, there's always a chance that happens. It's probably not the most likely outcome, but if you just look at dominance, I mean, this is where it, after it rallied to this point in 2018, which was still during the bear market, so it's clearly a bit different. It did get a fairly aggressive drop, and then it kind of just hung out in this range for a while, and eventually just moved higher. Wouldn't that be crazy if it just did that? Not my base case, but I guess it's a possibility until QE returns, right? If you overlay total assets of the Fed, dominance didn't top until QE started. And I feel like in my head, I'm like, well, QE's got to start soon, right? I mean, like, in fact, if you look at the balance sheet of the Fed, they've actually reached this point right here. The sort of this initial explosion and then this pullback, they've just reached that point. So in my head, I keep thinking, well, if dominance is going to go down in 2025, which makes the most amount of sense to me, like dominance should go down in 2025. I keep thinking, like, well, if dominance is going to go down, that means QE's got to return soon. But it hasn't returned. We have a Fed meeting December 18th. So not too long. We'll see what happens. All right. How high has Bitcoin gone? So it's gone up to 103,878. Let me check a different exchange and see if it went any higher. Let's check with Coinbase. Oh, it hit 104 on Coinbase. So I guess the all-time high right now is just 104. So it already hit 104. Remember earlier we were talking about like that 105 to 107 area being fairly extended from the 20-week moving average. Not to say it can't break through, but it is some level of extension, right? Let's go look at the short-term bubble risk. That really helps you identify. So this is a great metric for just kind of looking at how far Bitcoin is extended from its 20-week moving average compared to all these other rallies that it's had. over the last couple of years, right? So, you had your first rally back over here, and this is kind of how far it extended from the 20-week moving average. And then last year, you had sort of your initial rally also extended that same amount, but then you got a second rally that came later that even went further. This time we're here. So I guess the question is, is it just the extension gonna not go too much higher? Do you connect the dots and say it's gonna go all the way up here? I don't know. It's a really tough call. But if you look at it from one cycle to another, the extension from the 20-week moving average has certainly gotten, less spectacular as the years have gone on, right? Once upon a time, it was well extended above the 20-week moving average, and then every cycle it tends to be a little bit less extended from the 20-week moving average. One thing to note is that the mid-cycle top in 2019 was, you can see that the actual top for Bitcoin in terms of extension from the 20-week moving average went further than the mid-cycle top. Now, this is the mid-cycle top, if you want to call it that. That's when gold broke out, which is what corresponded to that mid-cycle top by Bitcoin. So that would imply that, maybe we're here, right? Which is really funny if we are, because guess where there is? December of 2020, right? And we're now in December 2024. So yeah, I think at this point for Bitcoin to not follow the cyclical view, which it very much seems like it is, and I've said for a couple of months now, it makes sense to just default to the cyclical view until proven otherwise. Market doesn't need a reason to go down, or sorry, it doesn't need a reason to go up. It needs a reason to go down, and the market hasn't been given a reason to go down. We'll see where the unemployment rate comes in on Friday, but with initial claims and layoffs still low, it's hard to imagine that the unemployment rate would be that bad. So we'll see. Again, year to date, compared to the halving years, we are right on track. Whether you compare it to 2023 or the average of the prior halving years, I mean, it's following both of them. So it's doing the same thing. And if it follows either one of them, it would be higher at the end of the year than it is right now. Right? Whether it follows 2023 or whether it follows the average of prior halving years. So certainly an interesting thing to keep in mind. What's dominance doing? It's slowly going up. Okay, it is slowly going up here. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be able to achieve back there, though. I'm not going to say it can't happen, because I saw it happen in December 2020, right? So if we've learned anything, is that you don't fade the king. You don't fade Bitcoin dominance with a strong conviction until the post-halving year. That doesn't mean it can't top before the post-halving year, but last cycle dominance topped early January of the post-halving year. So I look at this and I'm like, it seems like the top for dominance could be in, but there's also part of me that remembers December 2020. And it's one of those things where it doesn't have to repeat, right? It doesn't have to. But that's what happened, right? It got a big pullback in November and then just skyrocketed in December. So just keep it in mind. And look, all Bitcoin pairs got absolutely, they were doing absolutely great, and that was why I said take on, it makes sense to be diversified at 60% dominance, right? If you look at all Bitcoin pairs, I can't even find it anymore. Where is it on here? Here it is. So you look at all Bitcoin pairs. Look at this rally by all Bitcoin pairs from 0.34 to 0.53. And this is why I said, we did a video called Bitcoin Dominance addressing the elephant in the room, right? If dominance is already at 60% and we're saying that dominance is topping at 60 or around 60, well, how the hell do all Bitcoin pairs go down here? It means one of two things. They either don't go down there or dominance goes above 60, right? You can't have it both ways. The only way you can have it both ways, there's one way, technically speaking, you could have it both ways, right? The only way that you have alt Bitcoin pairs down here and Bitcoin dominance still topping around 60 is if ETH Bitcoin goes up, right? But I can't, I mean, look at this. You know something really crazy about this? Look at alt Bitcoin pairs. Look to see where they retrace to. Back to where they were in May of 2023. May of 2023. Guess where ETH Bitcoin would be if it retraced to where it was in May of 2023? Any guesses? Any guesses? 0.066. That's where ETH Bitcoin was in May of 2023. So, when we think about, is there a chance that dominance could still stay around 60 and all Bitcoin pairs go to those range lows? I guess the only way it would happen is if ETH Bitcoin gets a major rally and then alt Bitcoin pairs somehow drop. But it just doesn't seem like the most likely scenario at this point. I think the thing for ETH dominance is that, I don't know if it's going to come back down to this trend line down here. I would say worst case scenario for the cycle is it bottoms out around 9 to 10% dominance. Oh, there's another chart I was looking at earlier. It was others divided by total 3 minus others. So look at this. We talked about this a few months ago. But essentially what it's showing you is that smaller market cap altcoins have been outperforming higher market cap altcoins for a little bit, right? And we actually talked about this back in March, how smaller market cap alts were topping out against higher market cap alts at the same level they topped out at in January 2022. You see that? Same level. So I'm kind of interested to see what happens here. If it plays out in a similar fashion, if it just ends up being a lower high, is this, where is it going to go? I mean, right now it's sort of back up to the midpoint of that channel. Could it go all the way back up here? I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to think about. I do have to imagine that some of the miners would probably catch up a little bit with Bitcoin breaking out. I mean, you got Mara at 26. You got CleanSpark. What? I mean, CleanSpark got to be pretty beaten down at this point. I mean, it's back down to 15. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like gold and the gold miners, right? Gold miners are lagging gold. Bitcoin miners are lagging Bitcoin. And, I feel like it seems reasonable to think that at some point they're going to catch up, but I don't know when it's going to be. Bitcoin just continues to steal the show for now. And here, look, I mean, this is a great example, guys. Look, Bitcoin's up 5%. Most alts are down. And this is what I mean by when Bitcoin moves, the altcoin market bows to the king. Hal Dominus is back up to 57.25. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I mean, is that where, is that truly where it is? Where, where I just remember in 2020, right? I remember in 2020. And again, it's not an investing strategy. So get that, what, out of here. I'm not saying it is. Diversification is a good thing beyond 60% dominance. Okay. So I've argued with enough of you guys on Twitter at this point. I just remember in November of 2020, we all thought dominance had topped. And then it ripped us all a new one in December and went up again. I don't know if it's going to happen, but just something to keep in mind. All right. What do you guys got for me? I don't know if I have anything else for you guys. Monthly returns of Bitcoin. I mean, you can see it's, just kind of doing what it did last year. Quarterly returns, Bitcoin's up 63%. Last year it was up 57 in Q4. 2016, it was up 59 in Q4 by the end of the year. So it's actually outperforming Q4 2016 at this point. Someone says we're doing 107K tonight. Maybe. Am I taking Am I taking a break after 2025? Guys, there's not a lot of things I can promise you guys, right? There's only two sure things in this life, right? Death and taxes. Two sure things we can all count on. No matter what, death and taxes. It's gonna happen. But one thing is next cycle. I can't be the only guy, you know, preaching the Bitcoin dominance train. I can't. It's just too difficult. And a lot of you guys probably know what I'm talking about. And then the other 10,000 of you on here probably like, what the hell is he talking about going on about Bitcoin dominance? They just joined probably for the first time in 3 years and probably wondering what the hell Bitcoin dominance even is. But I don't want to be the guy to explain it to them. So my hope, because I'm not gonna do this forever, right? My hope is that first of all, I get a lot of things wrong. Right? I get a lot of things wrong. ETH never went home. Right? It never went home. And I, it is what it is. And I was wrong about that. I was right about Bitcoin dominance. I was right about ETH Bitcoin, but I was drastically wrong about ETH going home. And if it does go home at some point, then obviously we'll welcome it with open arms. But it just never happened. Um, and it's difficult because you want to tell people what you think, but a lot of times you get things wrong. No one has a crystal ball. But next cycle, I'm going to be relying on the people that were here this cycle to sort of help people understand Bitcoin dominance. Because if you held an alt through it and you watched it bleed for 3 years, for next cycle, there was a better way, right? And it was to just stick with Bitcoin for the entire ride until you get close to the post-halving year, right? So I'm going to rely on some of you guys to do that next cycle because it can't be me. It can't be me again. Um, I wish it could, but it takes its toll. Um, all right. Let me see. All right, Bitcoin's at 103. Gosh, time flies. We already been on here almost an hour and a half. Almost an hour and a half. How's Bitcoin dominance tracking with this pump? Yeah, I mean it's basically a carbon. I mean it's just Bitcoin dominance is basically just following Bitcoin, right? If you pull up Bitcoin USD and you overlay Bitcoin dominance, it's just following it, right? And that's the thing, right? Like if Bitcoin USD just keeps pumping, dominance goes up. But again, what did we learn from 2020? If Bitcoin drops and Bitcoin dominance still goes up, then whenever Bitcoin goes up again, dominance will soar. Okay. That'll be your telltale sign whether your alts are probably going to pump no matter what, right? But everyone else's alts, right? So the telltale sign will be whenever there's a pullback by Bitcoin USD, if dominance goes up during that pullback, then whenever Bitcoin goes up again, then dominance will skyrocket. Okay. If during a pullback by Bitcoin USD, dominance drops, then there's a good chance that it's not repeating the end of 2020. So, that I think is the key thing to consider here. All right. Oh yeah, someone's asking about the RSI. We did a video on it a few days ago. I can't imagine much has changed. I mean, this was a little bit of a move up, but I can't imagine it's drastically changed. If you look at the RSI, um, in the weekly's at 78. The weekly's not that important to me. I would stick with a 2-week. The 2-week RSI is what really helped identify the mid-cycle top, right? Back in March when the 2-week RSI hit 87. So right now the 2-week RSI is at 77. So if it goes up to 86, then you're probably getting too extended at that point to really sustain it for much longer, right? So, but the monthly RSI is probably going to be what you really want to focus on because a lot of the major tops have occurred around that time, and that would correspond to like 87 or so. Right now it's at 77, right? So if you find it up here in a month or two or a few months, then it might be time. It's not gonna last. It's not gonna go on forever, right? All right. I'm trying to figure out if what does this look the most similar to? I mean, is it just this or is it something else? So is it over here? Maybe it's this 2017. Sort of rallied up to the same level almost, and then it dropped one last time. Others Bitcoin is still a pretty decent rally there. Total 2. What's really interesting is look at total 3 divided by Bitcoin. Just ignore the USDT component. And then just sort of look to see where it bottomed here and go across. So you can see it sort of bounce from this level there, kind of bounce from that level right there as well. And that's where it just bounced from. Dominance lower targets. Well, if I stick with the data, I'd probably say it's going to be a higher low from last cycle. My base case at this point with dominance is that, if this is the top here, then you're probably just looking at it like this, right? So where essentially you're just converging, maybe it's just converging to like 50%, right? What if that is the outcome? That dominance is just converging to 50%. If the top is not in for dominance and you say draw it all the way like that, then I guess it's possible for it to do that and still do the same thing, but that's a tough call at this point. I mean, it seems like there's a good chance QE is going to begin soon. Normally, dominance goes down in post-halving years, but again, that's still a month away. All right, guys, if you're not subscribed, you gotta subscribe. Are we Oh yeah, make sure you guys like the video if you haven't liked it. I'm sure all of you have, but if you haven't. And again, you can check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium. Sell links in the description below. We got a pretty cool community over there if you want to guys check it out. We need more Dubious speculation shirts in the merch store. Don't we have shirts? I thought we had those shirts in I think we have them in stock. Would I sell my Bitcoin for your first house? Not really sure what you mean. I mean, do you mean you like need the money for a down payment or something? I guess it depends on what you mean. I mean, I'm not like, I mean, I get called a Bitcoin maxi for 3 years for being bullish on Bitcoin dominance, but I couldn't be further from the truth, right? I mean, for me, crypto, and I know this is sacrilege, guys, but like, the point is to make money to better your life, right? I mean, crypto is great and all, but at the end of the day, you got to do something with it, right? I mean, the point is to better your life, right? So I mean, if you get to the point where you have enough Bitcoin and that's the only thing standing in the way of you purchasing a house, for either you or your you and your family, um, I'll tell you this: I've seen a lot of people make life changing gains. I've seen a lot of people make life changing gains and then watch it disappear. Don't be that guy, right? Don't be that guy. If you make life-changing gains and it's truly life-changing, make sure you put some in the bank, right? You don't want to be the guy that made life-changing gains and you watched it all disappear because you were too stubborn to do anything with it. One of the reasons why, guys, 95% of you are guys. I know it because I look at the YouTube stats. 95% of you are guys, and I'm just telling you, you know, if a lot of the people that I've met, a lot of times, their significant other, their spouse, has a hard time getting on board with the crypto train, right? And I know, I mean, like only 5% of you guys are only 5% of my audience are females, and um, I think one of the reasons is because for a lot of them, right, crypto is like this black box where money goes, but it never comes out of, right? You always want to put money in, but you never want to take money out. And if you've been in Bitcoin long enough, right, you can't necessarily disagree with that idea to some degree because like Bitcoin today is at a higher price than it's ever been, right? So you could make the argument that it wasn't necessarily the worst strategy to not take any out. But at the same time, if you want to if you want your loved ones to be on board with this kind of stuff, you have to show them what's possible throughout an entire cycle, right? You have to show them what's possible. You take the risk, you bring those profits home, and you say, look what it did for us, why don't we do it again next cycle? But if you just throw money at it and you never bring anything back, you can't you have to understand why some people just don't like it as much, because a lot of times people make money and they squander it all away. Most of the shirts in the merch store are out of stock. Okay. All right, we'll start at 103. We actually did have another shirt I was going to launch. I was waiting, I was really going to wait until the end of the year to launch it. I mean, I could launch it sooner, but it was an Ethereum shirt. But you know, so I didn't know how people would react, but basically ETH does well against Bitcoin in post-halving years. Um, all right, a lot of people are asking me about USDT dominance. So let's go take a look. So this, I have to imagine, has broken down from this trend line. And we said that it would, right? We said that it would at some point. I mean, and the reason why it has to break down is because eventually it would imply that USDT dominance goes above 100%. So it can't hold forever. So I think what becomes reasonable now is to look for horizontal support levels, right? So this is your first horizontal support level, Perhaps the one beneath that one is all the way down here at 2.5%, right? So if you look at horizontal support levels, that's probably what becomes more important. And maybe you got to look at the same thing for USDT dominance plus USDC dominance. You start looking at horizontal support, not this higher low trend line stuff. So in this in this case, it would be there. It would be all the way about down here. One of the reasons, by the way, I mean, this stuff looks a little scary sometimes, but one of the reasons why this hasn't gone that much lower, despite the fact that total market cap has absolutely exploded, is because the market cap of USDT has also exploded, right? So if they just keep printing more USDT, then the dominance of USDT is going up whenever they print more, and then as long as it's going up about the same pace as the total market cap, then USDT dominance doesn't move. Now, recently, total market cap has been going up quicker than USDT dominance has, or than USDT market cap has been going up. So USDT dominance has been going down. But that's one of the reasons why total market cap has exploded and USDT dominance hasn't really gone that much lower. All right, yeah, I still need to get a new MacBook. I haven't done that yet. SPX divided by M2. I think the only way that the cryptoverse truly gets a larger correction in the short term is if the stock market sells off, right? And it's dangerous to bet against the stock market. The stock market generally just climbs the wall of worry. As far as S&P divided by M2, we are at the same level we hit in 1998. So basically S&P divided by M2 is basically at that same level it hit in 1998. So, I guess if it does get rejected there and it does drop, which is probably not going to play out the same way, but if it did get rejected at that level, like it did in 1998, then you would look for this support level, right? So it found support there, which happens to correspond to these highs. Now, I don't think you can look at this kind of stuff to make a cohesive investing strategy. For me, with the S&P, I just DCA low expense ratio index funds as long as the risk level is low enough. But if there is a pull, so again, I don't think you trade the S&P with the hopes that you're selling it. I don't think you sell stock. I don't think you sell index funds trying to time drops, because you're most of the time you're going to be wrong, and the one time you're right probably doesn't make up for the times that you're wrong. So it's not something you should try to time. But, if that were to happen, then yeah, it would have a negative effect on the cryptoverse. And even if it did happen, it might seem like everything's over, but in the .com era, you can see that it exploded even again. Yeah, I guess the only way, I mean, at this point, ETH is probably not going home. But I guess if something like that happened in stocks, then I guess it could still happen. But at this point, it just seems like it's not the most likely outcome, at least not in the short term. I mean, again, if you look at ETH, it's basically doing the same thing that Bitcoin's doing, right? It's just following a slightly diminished version of last year. So if it continues to follow that, it'll just do that. I guess if Bitcoin follows the QQQ still, where the QQQ launched in 1999 at around 48, Bitcoin's launched at 48K, had a pullback in August, kind of like how Bitcoin did, right? If you look at the weekly QQQ back then, had a pullback in August, and then a higher low in October, right? Bitcoin did the same thing. Pullback in August, higher low in October, right? So the same thing the QQQ did over here. And then in October, it just went vertical. And then it struggled to get through 100 for a few weeks, eventually got through 100, went to 120, then got a big drop. So I guess if you did get a typical, post halving year January correction. By the way, I mean when I show this, it might seem scary. I'm not saying it has to follow this. I'm just saying that a lot of times Bitcoin gets a correction in January of post halving years. Right, here's a 30% drop. In 2017, you also got a 30% drop in January of the post halving year, right? So 30% drop. I mean, yeah, it could take you to a higher price than it is today, depending on how how high Bitcoin goes. I mean, if Bitcoin goes up a lot and then it drops 30%, it could still be at a higher price than it is right now. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess that is sort of the argument, is that if it's a bigger drop, then obviously that would be detrimental. But that was when that drop occurred back then. Again, it was 54 weeks after the launch of the QQQ, which for this cycle wouldn't put it happening until the week of January 20th, which is not until the inauguration. So that's still about a month and a half away. All right, guys. Well, we'll see what happens. Yeah, Bitcoin, we're probably just going to sign off here because Bitcoin's not really moving. I would say this. I would say this. If Bitcoin stalls out or in the low hundreds and doesn't move for a day or two or something, you could see alts catch up a little bit, right? They might catch up a little bit. Um, if Bitcoin keeps moving, Bitcoin dominance will keep going up, more than likely. If Bitcoin drops and Bitcoin dominance goes up, then the next time Bitcoin goes up, dominance will likely go up a lot. Okay. So that's what I would look for. And I don't know which of those is going to play out, but we'll see. It's been an interesting time in the cryptoverse. Someone says, is it over for XRP? Let's go take a look. So XRP, so this is one of those that what you look for is, or what you look for are the double bottoms on the Bitcoin pairs. Right. So, and I did a video on XRP just a few days ago, basically talking about this very setup, right? How you look for these double bottoms, and then XRP Bitcoin basically had a very similar rally in November of 2020, right? It was over here. Um, I don't know. I mean, as far as its Bitcoin pair, I mean, it seems like it's in the short term. Maybe it's going to take a break for a little while. I don't know. It's really hard it doesn't really seem like this trend line really lines up. Maybe if you yeah, I guess if you connect it there, right? So if you connect these points, it looks like it went back up to that. But that's XRP Bitcoin, not XRP USD. So XRP USD, if we go look at the risk metric on it, it's at 0.804. So it is pretty high. But it's also not in the highest risk band. Again, there's no guarantee it goes to the highest risk band, but so far it's gone up to about 0.85 risk or so. So pretty high. By the way, I made a mistake in the video. I believe I think I was showing Bitcoin time and risk bands. If you look at XRP time and risk bands, it's basically the same, but throughout all of history, XRP has spent 1.76% of its time in the current wristband and only 0.85% of the time in the wristband higher than the current wristband. So we'll see what happens. Someone says, someone says, how's ETH not broken an all-time high? Guys, it did the same thing in last cycle. I mean, it was the same thing, right? I mean, I think a lot of people don't remember this, but in 2020, right? In 2020, if you go all the way back over here, it was December of 2020 and ETH still hadn't put in an all-time high. And it didn't put in an all-time high until January of the post-halving year, right? This is what I was trying to tell people about ETH Bitcoin, was that it might not put in an all-time high until well after Bitcoin has, and it might not occur. It might not happen until the post-halving year. So just keep it in mind. All right, guys. I think that will wrap it up here. I do appreciate you guys tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. Check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Links in the description below, or yeah, it should be in the description below. Intothecryptoverse.com. Again, subscribe as well. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to, but honestly, I probably wouldn't encourage that. YouTube Ben's very different from Twitter Ben. We'll wrap it up there, guys. I'll see you guys next time, and I do appreciate you guys tuning in to this 100K welcome party. And I know we didn't get it on every exchange, but at least on the main index here, we got to welcome Bitcoin to 100K for the first time ever. It's been a long journey, but we finally made it. And we'll see what the rest of the cycle has in store. So we will see you guys next time. Bye.